Pathogen Blast technical seminars are an Intertech production. For instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.
Now, as just a slight best practice, you may want to consider changing the name of that file, so something more generic like just jQuery.js. The pros are kind of obvious. If you have hundreds of web pages and you have a versioned name of your jQuery JavaScript file, well, as soon as you upgrade, you're going to need to go in all of those different pages and change the name of the file. If you just use a more generic jQuery.js, all you're going to have to do is once you download a new file, then you're just going to have to simply change the name of the file to jQuery.js instead of going into all of your web pages and updating those links. So that's, obviously a nice feature, but the cons of that, sometimes you can run into caching problems there. The browser may think that they've already downloaded jQuery.js and they continue to use some old version of jQuery. And there are tricks that you can do, lots of different tricks. Lots of websites suggest different approaches for dealing with caching issues. This is not, unique to jQuery. This is, just a general problem with client-side code for web applications. One trick that some people will do is to add a query string. And so, of course, a query string is just the question mark followed by some data. And in the query string, you can add some sort of a unique ID. I'll show you an example here that happens to be a JSP example, but you can obviously approach this with any sort of dynamic client-side language. So it could be PHP or ASP. In this case, I've got jQuery.js question marks. I'm starting my query string, and I'm just putting in the current time in milliseconds. So what that does is it tells the browser, hey, when you're trying to get this jQuery file, look, it's actually a unique link. You haven't gone to this exact link before because of the query string, because of the time in milliseconds. And when that gets sent over to the server is just going to ignore the query string. So it tends to be a nice strategy for dealing with caching issues. So we've got jQuery. We've downloaded the appropriate version. We've added it to our web application. Let's take a look now at what we need to do in our code. And we'll start with the jQuery identifiers. Basically, everything you're going to be calling in jQuery is going to be provided through a single object, a jQuery object. And there are two different identifiers that you can use to access this object. There's the $ and then the word jQuery. So both of those identifiers access the same object. You can choose whichever one you want, but obviously if you use the $, that's going to result in more compact code. So you'll see two examples here where I have a $.sum method and jQuery.sum method. Exactly the same. They're going to go and call the same method. It's just whatever you choose. Sometimes, though, you don't have the option to use, say, the $ because you have old legacy code that perhaps uses the $ as an identifier, maybe for a variable or a function or an object, or perhaps you're using some other third-party library in your web application that also uses the $ as an identifier. If you need to release jQuery's hold on that identifier so it doesn't break your other code, you can call $.noConflict. As soon as you do that, it releases its hold of the $ identifier, and now you can use jQuery as your new identifier. But sometimes even that's not good enough, and you want to have your own identifier to be used for all of your jQuery calls. In which case, you should note that the noConflict method will return a handle to the jQuery object. So if I do something like var jq equals $.noConflict, what's going to happen is it's going to release the $ identifier from jQuery, and now I can start to refer to the jQuery code through the JQ identifier I put right here. So here you see I now use jq.sum method. So which strategy is the best? It really doesn't matter. It's whatever you need to do. Just pick a single identifier and use it consistently to improve readability and, of course, maintenance. Another bit of syntax is the idea of method chaining. So you'll notice that, having a control over here. Sorry, my presentation has a mind of its own. So with method chaining, you're able to reuse a return value of a method to call another method. And what I mean by that is, take a look at our first code example. You'll see I have $.a method, $.another method, $.yet another method. So, your code can start to become very, very repetitive. And if you want to reduce that redundancy, that repetition, you'll see an example below where I'm able to call a method, and then right after that, I'm able to put another method and yet another method. That's because many of the methods that you'll call in jQuery will return a handle back to itself. And where you typically see this sort of a compactness of method chaining being applied is, let's say you're grabbing an element and you're doing a whole bunch of different style changes and maybe adding a couple of event handlers. We're going to see examples of this coming up, but that's an example where you'll typically see this method chaining being used. The final third example I have on the bottom is just sort of an example of how crazy, method nesting and chaining can get. So clearly, if you start to see something that resembles what you see down here in the third line, you may want to decide just to, hey, let's go with a little bit of redundancy so we can provide some clarity to our code. Again, that's not a jQuery best practice. That's, just a general coding best practice. So that's the general ideas with the syntax of jQuery. So let's look into some functionality. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, one of the things that we do the most when we're dealing with client-side code is handling elements, selecting elements. Again, we may want to read some value that's inside of an element so that we can send it on its way to a server, or maybe we have some placeholders in there where we're able to write into our whatever code we may have received from like an AJAX request and pop that into our page so we have some new graphical data to display. So let's look at how we deal with selecting elements. And before we look at jQuery, and this is something I'm going to do throughout the presentation, I'm going to show you how we handle this with traditional JavaScript. And then I will compare and contrast that to what you do in jQuery. Again, really to emphasize the benefit of write less, do more. So here's an example where I have a real simple input box. It's a text box. It has an ID, a first name. And if I wanted to get a handle to that text box, I would simply use document.getElement by ID and pass in the name first name. That's a very, very common method for grabbing a hold of an element. Another common method is to locate a target node, once I have one, and traverse the DOM tree. So here's an example of that, and ignore most of this code. Let's see if I can get a pointer going. There we go. So ignore most of this code except for where I'm pointing right now. This is really the end result of this is a callback function from an AJAX request. But what I want you to pretend is that XML DOM variable is really just a handle to an entire XML tree that I want to start to traverse. And so what I could do is that once I have that handle, I can say from that DOM, I want to get to the first child, and from that first child, I want its first child, and then I can get whatever other information I need that's traversing a DOM tree using the DOM API. So those are a couple of common ways that with traditional JavaScript that we're able to select and find elements on a page or in an XML document. Now jQuery simplifies this syntax by implementing a syntax that's based on cascading style sheets, so CSS. If you've used CSS before, you should remember that there's really three main types of selectors that you're going to look for: elements, IDs, and class. So consider the following example. I have a div ID here, and the ID for the div is employee search, and below that I have two different input tags, one with an ID of employee ID and division ID, so real simple HTML snippet. And if I wanted to select and change how those elements looked, one example I could use here is in my CSS. I could say, hey, for this div, I want you to select the div that has the ID of an employee search. That's what that pound sign is for. And below that, I want any children that are of the type input. So the element is an input. And if that, after you selected all of those tags, change the color to be blue. So again, this is just regular CSS. Another way, if I wanted to get a single input tag, I would use the pound employee ID. Again, that means grab the element with the ID, employee ID, and in this case I'm changing the background color to be white. So again, real simple HTML snippet with some simple CSS. But we'll see that in jQuery, that's exactly what they use. So here's my jQuery. And remember, the format is whenever I want to use, whenever I want to grab a jQuery function or method, I'm going to use that $, or I'm going to use jQuery, or whatever you've decided to use as your identifier. So I have $, and I pass in div pound employee search space input, just like we saw before, and that will select both input tags. Or if I wanted to grab that single input tag, it'd be the pound employee ID. Now notice that I've wrapped the selector with quotes. It can either be single quotes, it can be double quotes. Make sure you do that, otherwise it's not going to match any of the elements on your page. So the point being that this way that we're selecting elements is exactly like CSS. Now, you may be asking, why is that so great? What's the power there? Well, we'll look at some of the filters coming up, and that shows the real power of using.
For more free learning resources and to see the latest lineup of our instructor-led .NET, Java, and XML courses, visit us at www.intertech.com.